And now to our daily deep dive. There's been a lot of change in philanthropic circles so far in 2021. Bill and Melinda Gates, Warren Buffett, Richard Branson, Jeff Bezos. At the end of the day, the world of philanthropy is a pretty small club. It's made up of a handful of very powerful, very rich players who make decisions that impact millions of people around the world. To get into this further, I want to bring in journalist and author Anand Giridharadas. Anand, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
You bet. So when did it happen? When did all these rich people get to decide who goes into space, who gets research funding? How do they get godlike powers?
The birth of this kind of mega philanthropy by the people we would now call billionaires began, 100 plus years ago, really, with the kind of Carnegie and Rockefeller and Cooper fortunes that were so big, immediately raised this question of kind of the quasi-governmental power they would have over public life. And there was a wise clamor that rose from the public that I will summarize as, who the hell are you? Who the hell are you to have a say over any area of public life? Who the hell are you? And then what happened, over the ensuing 100 years is people started to, receive that money. The society started to receive that money through nonprofits and educational institutions and public radio and any number of other things. And in a sense, the society was collectively bribed into a silence about this money. We criticized billionaires for how they made their money sometimes. We criticized them occasionally if they avoided taxes. But when it came around to this latter-day generosity, that in many ways is only possible because of all the wage theft and system rigging and tax avoidance that they do, somehow when it came to that philanthropic area, we kind of gave them a free pass. And we ignored the fact that A, the fortunes were so often ill-gotten, and B, that the way in which the money was spent, far from solving our biggest shared problems, deepened the central problem of our time, which is that these people have far too much undemocratic power over public life.
What do you say to people who say, well, look, they're helping, look at the Gates Foundation. How many people, millions and millions and millions of people they've helped vaccinate across the world? Some of them are doing good. What's wrong with that?
Bad systems can produce good outcomes on particular things. If I were to say to you, would you be willing to shift to a monarchy if the economy could be managed more wisely by a king instead of a president? My guess is you wouldn't take that deal, and most people watching this wouldn't. So that's how we have to understand someone like Bill Gates doing some good work in some areas out of a larger system in which someone like him has those kinds of outsized resources to make quasi-public decisions over public life. A system that allows his fortune to be possible, that allows that vaccination drive to be done by a private guy. Such a system is morally flawed. Such a system values the hoarding of resources before allowing people to keep their own teeth because they have dental coverage. And so we cannot allow the occasional successes of very rich people to distract us from the fact that the system allowing them to accrue those fortunes is morally indefensible.
I want to ask you a little bit about that system because a lot of people really point to taxes. ProPublica did an analysis of tax data for 25 of the richest Americans. By the end of 2018, 25 of them were worth $1.1 trillion. If you compare that, it would take 14 million ordinary American wage earners to sort of put together that same amount. ProPublica also says that the personal federal tax bill for the top 25 in 2018, remember on that 1.1 trillion, was 1.9 billion. The bill for these wage earners, these regular Americans, $143 billion. How do they get away with it?
It is a scam, but it's a legal scam. And legal scams are the most important to understand because those are the big scams. So what ProPublica really brilliantly identified was a kind of meta scam of, in this country, we tax billionaires on their income instead of on their wealth, which is like handing out medals at a pie eating contest based on people's shoe size. It's measuring the wrong thing. Billionaires' fortunes are not measured in the income they have. In fact, they don't generally work for a living. They don't have salaries. Like they can make up salaries. But if you think about someone like Warren Buffett, the increase in resources he has every year is not income. It is the expansion of wealth through the accruing value of that wealth. The increased resources you and I have every year is income. And so when we tax a Warren Buffett the same way you and I are taxed based on income, what a Warren Buffett will do is, even as his fortune may expand by billions and billions of dollars in a year, he will essentially organize an income figure kind of his choosing. And they all do this. They can tell their accountant, I'd like this kind of income figure. And they can do any number of things to get an income figure they want. Income is literally just a thing that they set up for themselves. And so when we tax billionaires on income, we're defrauding ourselves, actually. And so it's incredibly important, I think particularly coming out of the pandemic, where there was a lot more attention paid to this, to start talking very seriously in this country about a wealth tax that would make these fortunes smaller.
But these billionaires have access to politicians. They fund campaigns. How do you ever see something like that really getting passed in Washington?
Well, you and I are talking about this, and people will watch this, and more people will hopefully talk about it, and maybe more people with a platform like yours will ask more questions about it. But this is actually a pretty popular policy. If you wanted to find something bipartisan in this country, a wealth tax might be it. The only people who don't want to do it are the people in Washington in those jobs, including on the Democratic side, many of them. And we have to overwhelm them with a public consensus so broad, so fervent, that they get in line and understand that either they enact these kinds of changes or we'll find people who will.
Is there a better way to do this? Can foundations and philanthropists do a better job than the government itself?
No. And this is one of the great myths. And you see it now with this space thing. People keep using this private billionaire spending, whether it's philanthropic or on space or whatever, as evidence that private money, private sector spending is so much more efficient than public sector spending. A problem like, how do we use our institutions to empower women to play all the roles they can and want to play? How do we fight discrimination against Black Americans? These are the kinds of problems that billionaires have shown very little efficacy in delivering against, but the government does remarkable work, can do better, can do much better, but does remarkable work through law and policy and institutions to advance those kinds of issues. So I actually like to turn around this question of efficiency because it's such a common talking point. I like to turn around back and say, which billionaire has done more for old people than Social Security? I'd love to, if there's a name, I'd love to hear. Which billionaire has done more for childhood hunger than government programs that feed kids in public schools? Which billionaire has done more for public health than Medicare and Medicaid? Which billionaire has done more for space than NASA did? We have to stop this notion of government being on the defensive, needing to justify its existence, and actually put these people who make latte finding apps for a living on the defensive. What is it exactly that you do?
What are some of the motivations behind giving? Is it purely generosity?
No, absolutely not. There's a whole mix of motives. And by the way, the motives people have, in other words, what's in their heart, is less important than the effects of this giving. So in this stew, you have generosity, or at least the performance of generosity, the performance being a quite important aspect of it. I don't know, but I would guess, Rena, that when you have given generously to anything in your life, I bet you have not hired a PR firm to tell people that you've done that. But these people do that. So that tells you a little bit about the level of generosity involved when your generosity comes with its own attached publicist. I think some of the other motives are a desire to use philanthropy as a drive-through reputational laundromat. The stench of how people made their money is acute in many cases. If you're the Sacklers and you made your money from opioids, if you are Jeff Bezos and you made your money busting unions and avoiding taxes, if you're Bill Gates and you made your money on a monopoly that was deemed illegal, you have a real reputational problem. And giving back, if leveraged correctly, if publicized properly, can wipe some of that reputational stink off you. It works remarkably. There's a further motive, or at least effect, of having further influence over public life. And this is where something folks really need to think about, because you can say it's an act of kindness, at least they're doing something kind. The act of kindness comes with power, comes with real power. You're making decisions about, who's on the board of your foundation, what diseases is your foundation prioritizing or not, which universities are getting money or not. Does Harvard need another $20 million check, or would a community college? And the question I would raise for your viewers and listeners is, who are you to make these decisions? The decision about whether Harvard or a community college needs $20 million that should have actually been paid in taxes and wages is a public decision. And it's public, not just because that money should have been paid as wages and taxes, but also because we chip in about half of that money as taxpayers. These folks get tax breaks. That $20 million that someone is donating to Harvard, they might get, $10 million back in tax breaks by donating that. You know who that's coming from? That's coming from us. But when we actually try to make the world better through taxation, through government programs, through systems that are public, democratic, institutional, and universal, that solve the problem at the root for everybody, you and I do have a say. And it's called democracy, and I believe it's worth defending.
So when you talk about American philanthropy and the influence and effect on public life, where do you see this going? How do you see it being able to change into something that you believe is a better use for society?
I think it is changing, and I'm very gratified by this. These were not the arguments people were making about the super wealthy in public many years ago. These were not the kinds of questions big media was raising several years ago. There has been a real shift in the narrative. If you look at the Branson space kind of dialogue, there were the usual billionaire simps kind of making a case for him and how wonderful it is that our glorious gilded overlords can now launch themselves into the ether. But there were a lot of people making arguments about taxes, making arguments about the government literally did this 60 years ago. Why is this being treated as so special? Arguments about why do we choose to have a kind of neo-feudal overclass that can, essentially colonize space, but also just colonize public life? It's a social choice to have billionaires. Billionaires exist at our pleasure. It is the courts you and I pay for that allow them to protect their resources. It is the police you and I pay for that allow them to guard their mansions. It's the roads you and I pay for that allow them to, sell their goods and services. It is the public schools you and I pay for that allow them to have talented people to hire for their work, for their offices. And so we need to step up and realize that we don't live under these people. Like, they live at our pleasure. And we need to step up the fight for a fair society that recognizes that it is more important, first things first, that people have the rudiments of a decent, thriving life than it is to protect the sacrosanct right to hoard billions of dollars.
Anand Giridharadas, author and journalist. Thank you so much for joining us, Anand.
Thank you for having me, Rena.